Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia daf Chav Gimel, Bava Metzia 23. We're going to start 7 lines from the bottom on 22b. May our Torah study be heard in the gates of heaven. May it be a merit for the salvation of the Jewish people, the guarding, the shmira of the chayalim, and the Yeshua, the Hatzalah of the shvuyim. They're the lost objects, the lost concept, the lost symbols of what the Jewish people are missing in our world today are each and every one of these hostages. So the Daf Yomi is discussing a dispute between Rabbah and Rava when it says in our Mishnah that the bundles in the public domain you get to keep Krechos Bershus Aram Harei Shalo. Are we talking about bundles that says Rabbah even if it has a sign on it nevertheless, you get to keep it because the sign is going to be trampled. And Rabbah said, no, that's only referring to when it doesn't have a sign on it. So the Gemara now discusses Tashma Krechos Bershus Arabim Harei Shalo on 7 lines from the bottom on 22b. You have a brayso that says if you have bundles in public, you get to keep it. Bershus Hayachad, but if it's in private, no Tolu Machris. You have to proclaim it. You have to make announcements about it. Put it up in the bulletin board. Now, lumos, but these large bundles, bein bershus harabim, bein bershus hayachid, the large bundles, whether in public or in private, no telu machris. Those you always have to make an announcement about it. So Rabba said that our Mishnah is referring to even our Mishnah is referring to a circumstance even where there's a sign on it. And how would Rabba, who says in a case where there's a sign on it, you can't keep it. How would he explain the price? Rabba Mataratz Tamei. Bisimin. Rabba says we're talking about a case where there's a sign on it. That's what the price is referring to. The Rabba Mataratz Tamei ben Malcolm. He says no, where the person found it in a specific place. Rabba Mataratz Tamei Bisimin. He says that we're talking about here a sign. So the Krechos Bershus Aram. So if you find it in public, you get to keep it. Harei Shalo. Why do you get to keep it? Mishum the midrasa, because people were going to trample on it, so the sign will be destroyed, or on top of Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. But Bershus Hayachid, but if it's in the private domain, no telu machris. He has to take it and make a proclamation upon it. The lo midrasa, because in the private domain, the sign will remain on it because people aren't going to trample on it. Now lumos, but if you have large bundles, bein Bershus Harabim, bein Bershus Hayachid, no telu machris. Then says Rabbah, if it's a large bundle, then you always have to make an announcement, even to Gavveyan or Midrasa, because since they're tall, nobody's going to make an announcement, nobody's going to step on it. The Rabbah Mataretz Tamei, whereas Rabbah explains, the Malcolm Krechos Bershus Arabim. Rabbah says, the Malcolm, we're talking about a case, when do you have to make an announcement about it? If it's a specific place. Why? Because he says, Bershus Arabim, Harei Shalo, if it's in public, he gets to keep it, diminished tafa, because even though it was found in a specific place, in the public it's going to roll, so you won't be able to give a sign based upon the place you found it. Whereas Bershus Hayachid, chayav la'achar, if you find it in private, you have to make an announcement, because there it stays in the same place. Va'alumos, ben Bershus Aram, ben Bershus Hayachid, no tomachrid. But large bundles, you always have to make a proclamation about a declaration, a public announcement. Kivan the Ikari Laminchtafa, because since they are very heavy, they're not going to move. So now the Gemara discusses another price as relates to Rabbah and Rava's dispute. Tashma Kikara Shal Nafton. So let's say you have bakery bread, which is kind of standard, so everybody, all the bread looks the same. And if you find it in Harei Shal, you get to keep it. Hashal Bala Bias, this implies that if it's a private bread, which is each unique, Chayav Achar, is that you have to make an announcement about. Shabbat bias my time. And why if it's a public one, can you keep it? Excuse me. Why if it's a private one, do you have to make an announcement? Kimin the isbu siman the made the yada idea rifted the inishu. So since it's a sign, people will know that this is this specific person's bread. And it doesn't matter if it's public or private. You have to make the proclamation, the announcement. So we see from here, even though it's a sign that's in public, you have to make a proclamation, even though it's going to be rubbed off. So isn't this a proof like Rava? Alma Simon also Adaris, have a Simon. So we see from here that this is like Rava, that if it's a sign that's eventually going to be knocked off, it's still a sign and you have to make an announcement. Tiyufta de Rabba, isn't this a refutation of Rabba? So says Rabba, no, Amracha Rabba, Hasamainu time. And what's the reason there that if you find it in public, you have to announce it? Mishum, because there's a difference with respect to food, not just bread, but all food. The commentaries say Mishum de Ema Virin Open, because people are not going to walk by while there's food on the ground. They have to pick it up. And that's the concept that if you find food on the road, you're not allowed to just walk past it. You have to pick it up. It doesn't refer to, like, let's say you see half a piece of pizza on the ground in DuPont Circle. That's not your obligation. The commentaries say because that's not food anymore. Nobody would eat that. So now we say, but maybe there were non-Jewish people who weren't careful about these laws, and they are going to trample it. Well, the Gemara says, no, non-Jews also wouldn't touch it because they would be worried about that maybe there's some black magic on it. Gemara says, but there's animals and there's dogs that they would trample on it. Gemara says, no, we're talking about a case of Asr, we're talking about a case where there's no animals or dogs there, and they're in, let's say, a museum or something. But Gemara says, well, let's say this dispute between Rabba and Rava, where Rabba says a simon in public is not a simon, and Rava says it is a simon that's going to be trampled on for the time it's still a simon. Maybe this relates to the dispute of our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda said that our Mishnah called over sheish bo shinoi chayav lahachris. Anything that has a distinguishing mark on it, you have to proclaim. And what's the example of that? You have to announce. Keitzad matzah igol b'sochel cheres, kikar b'sochel moos. Let's say you have figs within a piece of pottery or a loaf of bread with money on it. We call the Tanna Kama Savar Harei L'Shalo. Tanna Kama says you could keep these. Now, what's the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama? So the Gemara is going to offer two versions of this dispute. That's going to take up most of the rest of the daf. So Savrua, the Gemara's assumption is the Kuli Alma Siman Abame Elav have a siman, that even though you didn't put this sign there, if it came on its own, it is a siman, like the pottery falling on the figs. Siman Abame Elav have a siman. Umavirin al ha'ochen. And everybody says that people would walk by the food and trample it. And my lab, so therefore, what are they arguing about? Besimina also Adaris Kamifli. They're arguing about whether or not a sign that's going to be knocked off, whether it's considered a sign. That Marasavar lo have a siman. The Tanakama, the Chachamim of our Mishnah say it's not a sign, therefore you keep it. Marasavar have a siman. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says it is a sign. So we see from here that Rava is against the Tanakama of our Mishnah, which is a problem. Why would Rava go against the Chachamim? So Amar Rav Zvid Mishmei de Rava. So Rav Zvid answers in the name of Rava, no. These Salkadai Tachtakal Savar Tanakama Siman also Adaris Olavi Siman Mavirin al Ochon Kikar Shal Bias Precious Arabim. We have a problem. If you want to say, like you're saying the Tanakama says that a sign that's going to be trampled on is not a sign like Rabba, and that you would walk by food and trample it. So if that's the case, if you find the loaves of bread of the Bava Metzia of the private person in public, why do you have to proclaim it? Why do you have to declare it? Am I machris? So therefore, Rav Zvid says, everybody holds like Rava. Well, the Chachamim also hold like Rava. Sign that's going to be trampled on is still a sign. Everybody says that you would trample on the food. So if that's the case, why is there a dispute? Why does Rabbi Yehuda say you can't keep it? But here we're arguing about if the sign comes on its own. The Tanakama Savar, the Tanakamas of the position, Siman Abame Elav will have a Siman. They said, since you didn't put the sign there, it's not a Siman, whereas Rabbi Yehuda Savar have a Siman. And so therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says it is a Siman. That's a dispute. The Rabba would say, no, that's not the dispute. The Kuli Alma Siman also Adaris will have a Siman. Since you're going to trample on this, it's not a sign. But they wouldn't walk over the food. And so therefore they wouldn't trample it. And Rabba says, and Rabba says, but here they're arguing about whether the sign that comes on its own is a sign. Tanakama Savar Lo Ave Siman. Tanakama says it's not a sign. Rabbi Yehuda Savar Ave Siman. Now there's a whole other version of this dispute, which is very similar. But Ika de Amri, alternative version of this discussion is Savrua de Koyama Siman Abba Me'elav Ave Siman. Everybody says that a sign that comes on its own. The Gemara's assumption is that they're saying in our mission that everybody's saying a sign that comes on its own is a sign. But if a sign is going to be trampled on, it's not a sign. And Ma'ila, so what are they arguing? Whether or not you walk by food and trample it. That the Chachamim say you trample it, and Rabbi Yehuda says you don't. So Amar Razvid Mishmei de Rava. So Razvid says in the name of Rava, Isa Kedai Savar Tanakama Siman also Adar so Ave Siman, and so therefore this is a dispute. This is a problem for Rava because everybody here is saying Siman also Adar is not a Siman, and so Razvid comes and defends Rava. He says no, if you want to say that Tanakama says Siman also Adar so Ave Siman Umavirin Al Ochen, then if that's the case, Kikar Shal Balabais for Shusar Rabba my Machras. Why do you have to declare the loaves of bread in public? Why do you have to announce it? Everybody says a sign that's going to be trampled on is like Rava. It is a sign. And everybody says they're going to trample on it. And here they're arguing about whether or not the sign that comes by itself is considered a sign. Tanakama Savar Siman Abba Me'elav will have a siman, that it's not a sign. And Rabbi Yehuda says Siman have a siman. The Rabba Amrochan, how would Rabba explain it? He would say that everybody says not a simon. And you're not going to trample on the food, so therefore you're not going to destroy this sign. But they're arguing about a sign that comes on its own. Tanakama Savar Siman Abba Me'elav will have a simon, and Rabbi Yehuda Savar have a simon. So Rabbi Yehuda says it is a sign. So now we have some general rules to finish out the bottom of the Amud. Says Amar Avzvid Mishmei de Rava, Kol Davedasa. You have a general rule about a lost object. Kivan da Amar Vavile L'Chisaron Tis. Whoa, I lost my money. Miyayish. That's a sign. Once a person says, "Whoa, I lost my money," that's a sign he's given up hope. Miyayish le'minah. Amar Avzvid Mishmei de Rava Hilchosa. We have halacha Kreichos Bershus Harabim that if you find loaves of bread in public, he gets to keep it. Bershus Hayachid. But if it's in private, if it looks like it fell down, so he lost it, he gets to keep it. If the person placed it there, no tol machras, he has to take it and declare it. That's if there's no sign on it. But if there's an actual sign, if there's an actual sign, it doesn't matter where it is or how it's put there, you have to announce it. Now we say, on the top of 23b, macharozo shall dagim, if you find strings of fish, that you get to keep it. And now yesterday in the Slichos, we referred to the Haman's sons were hung up like strings of fish, meaning it's an image of a fish being strung up. It's a popular image. And you get to keep it because there's no sign. It's not considered a sign. So the Gemara says, but why not? So why don't we say that the way you tied it there is a sign? The Gemara says, no, Bekatra did size it. They were tied like the fishermen, meaning tied in a normal manner. The Koyama and the Katra will have it. That is the way everybody ties it up. So the Gemara says, we'll have a minyan simon. Why don't we let the number of fish be the sign? No, but minyan and deshavan. No, it's the same number. Like you buy a dozen eggs, that's how you buy the fish or whatever, 3 to a string or something. Minya and have a simon or low have a simon. So they say, well, let's say in general, can number be a sign or not? They ask Rav Sheshes. I'm Rav Sheshes, Tanisua. Well, says Rav Sheshes, we learned this in a brisa. Let's say you find a silver utensil or a copper utensil or a broken piece of lead, the kol kli matachos, and any metal utensil. Then you don't return it unless the person can give you a sign, or he can tell us about the weight. So we see from here, the mishkal havisimin mida minyan nami havisimin. From the fact that the weight is a sign, surely the measure and the number is also a sign. That's the argument. Chatichos shel basar, if you find pieces of meat in the public domain, then you can keep them. So the Gemara asks the question, am I allowing mishkol simon? Why don't we say the weight is a sign? But mishkol deshavin. No, it's a common weight. It's like they sell everything they sell these pieces of meat by the pound, let's say. Well, why don't you say what type of meat it is? That should be a sign. Oh, the dafka, oh, the atma. Well, maybe it's from the neck or the thigh. Rashi says here the dafka is it's savar. But some say, Rashi says, that it's the flanken, the cholent meat, right? So that's what Rashi gives both possibilities. So, Milo Tanya, didn't we learn matzah chatichos dagim v'dag na shochayv la'achar? Then we say that if you find a piece of fish or a fish with some bites out of it, you have to take you have to announce it. But if you find barrels of wine, of oil, of grain, and olives and figs, you get to keep it under these circumstances. So therefore, under these circumstances, you get to keep it. So if that's the case, so we see from here that by pieces you have to proclaim, because they could give a siman which piece it came from. So just like piece of fish, you have to announce. So too by the pieces of meat. So Gemara says, no, simana pipsaka. No, the Gemara says, what are we talking about here? What by the fish that we have to make an announcement that there's a sign that they cut it differently. That there's a sign in the psaka they cut it differently. The Gemara explains kiha the Rabba Barafuna mechatechayatlosa karnasa. Rabba Barafuna, when he would cut his when he would send meat to his wife through a non-Jew, he would cut it in an unusual manner. We learned this in Beitza because he wanted to make sure that the meat was watched. So to make sure that it was his meat, he cut it like a triangle. And dekananimi dekatani dumya de dag nashach, that it's similar to a fish with a bite marks out of it, meaning to say that it has a bite in it to prove that this is this fish. Shma mina. So we see from here that the meat is a sign only if it's cut in a specific way. And here Rashi it's not the most unusual thing, but it's not typical. Rashi has a diagram here of a triangle, which of course we know that became our practice on Purim, that we eat hamantashen, which is the triangle. And so therefore this is exciting for us that on Purim Day we come to the eve of Purim, we come to this daf which talks about a triangle, which is the hamantashen hat. But it's not the only reference to Purim on the daf. The last word on this daf is bepuria, which actually some commentaries like the Marsha say is a reference to Purim as well. I don't know if we're going. The reason I'm mentioning that now is that we might not only get up to that part for tomorrow's daf, but still we'll mention it. So the Gemara says, Amar Mar Chavio Shel Yaim Shel Shem Shel Tvua Shel Grogros. Let's say barrels of wine, of oil, of crops, of olives, of shel zaytim, shel grogros, figs. So arei elu shelo, you get to keep them. But didn't we learn kada yaim and kada shem and chayv lachrit? But then we have a different announcement that you have to announce the jugs of oil and the jugs of wine. So when do we say that you have to announce it? If there's a seal on it. So Rashi says that their barrels were made out of pottery, and they put a pottery cover on it, and then they would put some plaster around it to attach the cover so that the smell wouldn't go out. And in the days of Shvat or Nisan, that they sell their barrels to the shopkeeper, like 10 or 15 of them together, they take from their covers and they taste the wine. And then they go back and they reseal it around it. And that reseal is called a roshem. And then the shopkeeper takes it to his house. And our Mishnah is talking about this type of barrel which was resealed. And that there are some who do the seal, and then there's some who take it open and sell it immediately. So what we're talking about here is when it says you have to make a proclamation about it or an announcement, that's where it was resealed. And they have their specific reseal. They call it the brisa. So the brisa that says that you could keep it is bipsucha. So our brisa that says you get to keep it is talking about an open barrel. But how could that be? Clearly, if he leaves an open barrel around, it's going to be eaten by the insects. So the Gemara says, that's going to be destroyed on its own. So Amar Voshaya b'meitzif. Rav Voshaya says, no, we're talking about he put like a cover on it, but he just didn't seal it. And so there's no sign, and it's also not, he's not destroying it because he's protecting it from the snakes and other creatures getting in. Abaye Amar Afilu Tema Idi v'Idi b'Rosham. You can even say that both of them are with a seal, of this reseal. Before the wine cellars were opened up, so it wasn't the time yet to sell it, he's the only one who made this reseal. So therefore, it was a good sign. But once they open it up, everybody's doing it, and so therefore the Roishem is not a sign. Like once Rav Yaakov bar Abba found a barrel of wine after they started opening it up, and also it came to Abaye. Abaye said to Rav Yaakov bar Abba, he said you could keep it. So now Rav Bibi asked the question from Rav Nachman. He said the following question is, he says, Makom is, if you want to say I found it in this place, is that considered a siman or lo ave siman? Is that going to be considered a marker that you return it? Amroi Tanisua, we learned in the Brisa, Matzah Chavio Shel Yaim Chavio Shel Shemen. He says, well, actually, so he says, if I found barrels of wine or oil, v'shel tfuah, v'shel grogos, v'shel zeitim, or he gets to keep it. If you want to say that the place where he found it is the sign, l'chor's makom, let him declare the place. So Amar Rav Zved Achmai Askinan Birakta Dinara. No, we're talking about a place that where the wine was coming to the city in a ship, and the purchasers are basically unloading the ship, and they put on the banks of the river, and they take it one at a time, and sometimes they forget it. So basically, everybody leaves it there. It's the Rakta Dinara, and so therefore, there's no sign, as we'll explain. Amar Rav Mari, my time. And what's the reason why it's not a sign? Amar Rabbanan. You're not the only one who's forgetful and leaves the barrels of wine there. And so therefore, just like you put on the banks of the river, so too did everybody else. And so therefore, it's not an indication. Alternative version, Amar Amari, my time Amar Rabbana Rakta Dinara Lo Ave Siman. Why do we say that the banks of the river is not a sign? Why do we say a place is not a sign? Just like this place was for you, so too your friend happened to put it on this place. And Rashi says, what's the difference between the two approaches? That let's say he intentionally put it there. That still is not a sign. There was a guy who found tar in which is something that generally speaking doesn't have a simon, and he found it in the basically found it in the winery. He found the kufra in the beimatzarta. Asla kamei the Rav. So Rav said to him, go keep it. He saw that the person was embarrassed to keep it. Rashi says he was like tongue-tied. And he wasn't sure if he can accept what the rabbi said. He says, go give some of this tar to my son Chia. Because he says, that proves to you that I think it's okay. He wouldn't take it for himself, because a rabbi, if he gives a ruling about something, is not supposed to himself participate, but his son could. And so do you want to say that Rav is in a position that a place is not a sign? So the Gemara says, so you want to say we see a proof from here. So, by the way, Rav's uncle was Chia, and he named his son after his uncle, it seems, from here. So do you want to see from here that Rav is saying a place is not a sign? So no, he says, no, the reason this is not indication of what he thinks about sign, but it's here because he said the owner for sure gave up hope, because they were thinking that he saw that things were growing on it, and so therefore a lot of people had walked by. Clearly, the owner had given up hope to ever recover it. Okay, we'll stop the recording here.